Most tax pros leave a message.
It's Jane. I'm moving on to a TurboTax expert who beat your price. Adam Devine, tell him how I feel.
Hey, tax pro, she's been thinking twice. Best believe TurboTax will beat your price. This is a tax break.
Switch to a TurboTax Live expert and we'll beat what you paid your pro last tax season. Make the switch at TurboTax.com/beatyourprice. TurboTax full service only. Sign up by 12/20/2024 and file by 4/1/2025. Full details at TurboTax.com/beatyourprice.
Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadline so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
If you are interested in listening to every single episode of this podcast ad-free with no interruptions, then you could subscribe to 3D Printing Basics through Patreon, Spotify, or Apple Music. Every single link will be in the show notes below. Thank you for supporting, and if you're not, no worries, just enjoy this episode. Hello, and welcome back to 3D Printing Basics. This is episode number 37, and in this episode, we're going to be troubleshooting our 3D printers. I've been getting a lot of questions throughout the entirety of my podcast with people who are having problems with their 3D printers and they just don't know how to solve it. So I thought I would go over some of the main issues that come up when 3D printing and some simple fixes and some alternative options for these issues. Before we get started, I would like to mention that I have also created a YouTube channel for this podcast. I've uploaded every single episode onto the YouTube channel. It's called 3D Printing Basics Podcast, and I have a link to it down in the show notes. If you would like to subscribe, please do so. That would really help me out. There's also a ton of other ways to support me down in the description below, and if not, no worries at all. Alright, let's get right into this episode. So the first thing that I want to talk about is kind of what I think is the end-all be-all, the first thing you should try whenever you run into any kind of 3D printing problems. And that for me is to run the calibration tests or whatever automatic tests your printer comes with. For me, whenever I am having any kind of problems when I'm 3D printing, the very first thing that I try before I even start looking into anything is I run the calibration tests on my printer. These Bamboo Labs that I have, the calibration tests that they come with are very thorough, and I would say a solid 7 out of 10 times the calibration tests fix the problem right away and I can just get right back into printing. So that's just a nice, thoughtless thing to try, and it can save you a lot of frustration down the line, because I know I've definitely dove into trying to fix printers. I've even bought parts for printers when all it really needed was a simple calibration test and it started printing good as new. So just something to think about before you start diving into getting new parts, or you start diving into forums trying to figure out what's wrong with your 3D printer. If it has any kind of automatic tests, like something that it did right when you got it, or you can easily access and have it run an automatic test, just try that and see if that fixes the problem, because I feel like there's a pretty good chance that it might just fix the problem. And if it does fix the problem, great, you just saved a ton of headache and a ton of time. And if not, no worries, it's just one of the things to check off when you're trying to fix your 3D printer. This episode is brought to you by PCBWay. If you're into 3D printing, you know how important precision is, and PCBWay delivers that, not only in custom PCB manufacturing, but also in 3D printing services. Whether you need high-quality parts for your next big project, rapid prototyping, or even CNC machining, PCBWay has got you covered. With a wide range of materials and super competitive pricing, they're your go-to for bringing your designs to life. Check them out at PCBWay.com. Again, that's PCBWay.com, and take your projects to the next level. The first problem I want to dive into today is that of under-extruding. What I think is definitely the biggest problem when it comes to 3D printing, and definitely the one problem that I get the most emails, messages, just the most questions about overall. Under-extruding can happen for a variety of reasons, but basically what it is exactly what it sounds like. It means that the printer is not pushing out enough of the melted filament when it's going around and around, which leads to ugly spots. It leads to basically just air being printed instead of filament where it needs to be printed, and you come out with really ugly looking parts that are missing just whole chunks of their geometry because your printer is under extruding. And the main fix that I think can be applied to this situation would be to check your nozzle temperature, especially it's definitely important with PLA, but especially if you're using a specialty kind of filament like TPU, especially PETG, ABS, ASA, carbon fiber, any kind of material like that. If you're getting under extrusion, you should definitely check your nozzle temperature because that could be a big problem. I know, especially in my experience with TPU, printing TPU, the suggested temperature that was on the filament itself was actually not good. I was printing at like 250 degrees Celsius, and it was really under extruding because it was too hot. It was essentially boiling off parts of TPU, and it was making it under extrude. And so I lowered the temperature about 30 degrees to about 220, and it printed perfectly after that. So I would say nozzle temperature is definitely the biggest thing to think about if you are under extruding. But some other options that could be happening are the nozzle could be clogged. There could be a little chunk of something inside the nozzle that isn't coming out, and that could be blocking part of the entryway for the filament to come out of the nozzle, which would then result in under extrusion. You could look at the flow rate settings. That's pretty rare, but there definitely are sometimes maybe you accidentally clicked a number when you didn't mean to, but the flow rate could just be all out of whack, and that could be causing your parts to be under extruded. And another thing, something that I have personal experience with, is extruder jams. If you have really low level, like bottom of the barrel, C-level filament, parts of it can break off inside the extruder and jam up in there. And that makes the extruder have to work extremely hard to be able to push out the filament, which could result in under extruding. That's a problem that I've had before, and I have had to completely disassemble extruders to get a tiny little piece of filament out, which isn't fun. But that's just another something to think about. So to summarize, the nozzle temperature for under extruding is the main issue that I would look for, as well as clogs, flow rate, and extruder jams. All right, now that under extruding's out of the way, I want to tackle the next problem that you may have when printing, and this would be first layer adhesion. First layer adhesion is so important because if you don't have perfect bed adhesion on that first layer, it will start to compound itself as the layers build up, because say you have a corner popping up and it's not completely adhered to the layer, to the build plate, that will steadily start to rise and rise and rise, and it will build up and compound the air to the point where you have an unusable part by the end of the print. So first layer adhesion is very, very important. And the main fix that I have for this is cleaning your build plate. Over time, as you take prints in and out of the machine, the oils from your hand, maybe dust, and just other external factors can get on the build plate and cause it to not adhere as well to these prints. So the main thing that I would think about if you're having first layer adhesion problems is to clean your build plate, whether you have detergent like Bamboo Lab suggests. Personally, I use isopropyl alcohol whenever I'm cleaning my build plates, and that works just fine. You can also use soap and water, just anything that cleans your build plate. I would definitely suggest that as being the first way to kind of tackle these first layer adhesion problems. Some other options, if that doesn't really work, is you can check your bed temperature. Not super common, but sometimes your bed temperature may be out of whack, especially if you're printing these super tough filaments like ABS and ASA and carbon fiber. Your bed temperature needs to be pretty high in order to ensure the good first layer adhesion, so make sure you check that. You might consider getting an enclosure for the same reason. If the surrounding area is too cold and you're using tough filaments like that, it might be difficult to get a first layer adhesion. So if you have an enclosure, I would suggest using it. And maybe you just need a new build plate. Sometimes these stock build plates that these printers come with are just really bad and not good at first layer adhesion, and you might have to go out and get a third-party build plate, as unfortunate as that is. But that's just something to look into. So to summarize, for first layer adhesion, something that is so important in 3D printing, the main fix I would say is cleaning your build plate. You can use detergent, isopropyl alcohol, hot water, and soap. And some other options are looking at your bed temp, maybe getting an enclosure, and maybe getting a new build plate. All right, let's jump into the next issue. And this next issue is pretty common, especially among PLA, which is the most common filament that is out there and one that I would expect the majority of my audience to be familiar with, and that is stringing. Stringing is basically when you just have little strings of filament going back and forth, especially when you're printing over open air, like when you have two towers that you're printing between. Oftentimes when the nozzle goes back and forth, it will leave little strings, little spider webs, like when you use hot glue, and that could totally ruin the quality of your prints. And overall, it's just not fun to deal with. It's not fun to clean up, and it makes your parts look super ugly. And so the main fix I have for stringing in your prints is to dry your filament. A lot of times stringing is due to the filament being too wet. There's too much moisture in there. Now, whether that's because you're in a humid environment or the filament is old or whatever reason, I would suggest you dry your filament, whether you have a filament drying system or you built your own like me, or you can use the printers like Bamboo Labs printers have a filament drying setting, or you can just toss them in the oven for a few hours. But either way, I would suggest drying your filament first, because that is the most likely culprit for why you have stringing in your prints. Other issues that to look into when you have stringing problems is your retraction settings. Sometimes these printers have weird default retraction settings, and if you scale those way up, especially if you're using something like TPU, I know I've had problems with TPU and stringing because the retraction settings was like 0.4 millimeters, and I jumped it up to literally 6 millimeters, and that fixed the stringing problems for me. You can look at your extruder gear tension, which is the two gears that sandwich the filament and push it into the nozzle. Sometimes that gear can be way too loose, especially like if you're printing something like TPU. Make sure you check that out. And also you could try using a prime tower. For me, I've used prime towers in the past. Even though they're normally for multicolored prints, you could use it for just the first print, and that kind of gets the stringing out of the way, and because it builds up and it's just a junk piece. So if you start using a prime tower, it goes to that first on every layer and builds that up. So maybe you can get all the stringing out of the way, and then you won't have any stringing when it's time to print the actual part. So just to summarize, for stringing, big problem, especially with PLA and TPU among beginning 3D printers. The first fix and the main fix that I would suggest is drying your filament, whether you have a printer that does it, you have an official one, an official filament dryer, you have a janky one like I made, or you stick it in the oven. Some other options are retraction settings checks, extruder gear tension checks, and using a prime tower during your prints. Okay, the final troubleshooting aspect that I'm going to go over is something that has become more and more common recently, especially as print speeds have picked up as 3D printers have evolved in recent years, and that is ghosting and ringing. For those of us who don't know what ghosting and ringing is, it's basically imperfections on your parts when you are using high-speed printers. Basically, if it goes around a corner, it almost looks like a second aspect or a second corner is being printed, but when you run your hand over it, it's really tough to explain without an image. But basically, ghosting and ringing are imperfections on your parts because of the vibrations that come with high-speed printing. And the main fix to these issues is running your calibration tests. I know I said running calibration tests was the main fix to everything, but ghosting and ringing, especially with these high-speed printers, fixing that is going to be a part of the calibration test, because the calibration tests do vibration frequency tests. They check all of that, and these tests are made so that problems like ghosting and ringing don't happen. So I would definitely suggest, if you're having problems with that, if your prints aren't coming out as high quality as you know they can, and they have weird imperfections that look strange, run your calibration tests, because these tests, especially nowadays on the newer printers, they're built specifically for this issue. Some other checks is just going to be general maintenance on your printer, because if you're having ghosting and ringing, it might be because you have some issues with your printer build quality. So you can check things like tightening the belts, you can oil the rods up, you can clean the rods themselves. And that's saying for oiling rods and cleaning rods, like for Bamboo Labs, you want to oil the steel linear rods that they use, but don't oil the carbon fiber rods that they use. Obviously, you just want to clean those with isopropyl alcohol. And if all else fails and you're really having a tough time, you might want to consider slowing down your print speeds, because as fast as these print speeds are advertised, for Bamboo Labs. I know it's either 300 or 600 millimeters per second print speed. They're not going to be able to consistently print that fast. That's a very, very small percentage of the time that your printer is actually going to be moving that fast. So if you have your settings dialed up to printing that fast all the time, just know that that isn't usually possible. So you might just need to look into slowing down your print speeds. And so to sum it up, ghosting and ringing, it's a big problem and not always noticeable until the print is done. Something to look for, the main fix to that is going to be run your calibration tests, especially nowadays. Like I said, these new printers, they have these tests built in and they're specifically for fixing these kinds of problems. And some other options to fix it are just general maintenance on your printer, tightening belts, oiling, and cleaning rods. Just because if you have anything like that that's out of the ordinary, and you got to keep your printer up to date and you got to keep it maintained, and that's going to keep it printing at its best. And if all else fails, slow your print speed down. And that's all I have for you today. So thank you for checking into this week's episode. I hope you learned a little something about how to troubleshoot your printer when you are having some print problems. I definitely think that I'm going to make some more episodes about this just because there's definitely some more issues. So if you have any other issues that you would like me to discuss when troubleshooting your printer, please leave them down in the comments below or contact me directly. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.